You sit there, don't you, watching them work their magic on others, thinking you're too smart to fall for their games. But here's what Niccolo Machiavelli understood 5 centuries ago that you're only beginning to grasp now. The manipulator isn't some cartoon villain twirling their mustache in the shadows. They're the colleague who always seems to know exactly what to say, the friend who somehow makes you feel guilty for saying no, the partner who turns every argument into your fault. They've studied you longer than you've studied them, and while you've been playing checkers with your emotions, they've been playing chess with your entire psychology. The first savage truth Machiavelli would whisper in your ear is this: never reveal your true intentions to someone who has already revealed theirs through manipulation. When someone shows you they're willing to twist reality to get what they want, they've just handed you the most valuable intelligence you could ever possess. But what do most people do? They continue to be honest, transparent, authentic, believing that somehow their moral purity will inspire the manipulator to change. This is the thinking of sheep, and Machiavelli had no patience for sheep. The manipulator has already shown you their hand. They've already demonstrated that truth is negotiable to them, so why would you continue to play by rules they've already abandoned? Instead, you become the fox. You smile, you nod, you appear to go along, but internally you're cataloging every technique they use, every psychological pressure point they probe, every emotional button they attempt to push. You're not being dishonest, you're being strategic. There's a profound difference between the two, and that difference is what separates those who get devoured from those who do the devouring. The second way to outsmart these psychological predators requires you to embrace a concept that will make you uncomfortable. You must become boring to them. Manipulators are emotional vampires. They feed on your reactions, your explanations, your desperate attempts to prove your innocence or justify your decisions. Every time you defend yourself, every time you try to make them understand your perspective, every time you engage with their twisted logic, you're providing them with the psychological nutrition they crave. Machiavelli observed that people are moved more by what they see than by what they experience directly, and manipulators understand this instinctively. They create drama, chaos, confusion, because these states make you vulnerable, make you reactive, make you easy to control. But what happens when you refuse to provide the reaction they're seeking? What happens when you respond to their provocations with the emotional equivalent of watching paint dry? You become psychologically invisible to them, not because you're weak, but because you're no longer profitable. Think of it this way. A manipulator invests energy into pushing your buttons because they expect a return on that investment. They expect anger, defensiveness, guilt, confusion, some form of emotional chaos that they can then exploit to their advantage. But when you respond with calm indifference, when you treat their psychological games with the same level of engagement you'd give to someone reading you their grocery list, you've fundamentally altered the cost-benefit analysis of their behavior. They're expending energy and receiving nothing in return. This violates the basic economic principles that govern all human interaction. And the manipulator, being fundamentally a creature of efficiency, will eventually move on to more profitable targets. This doesn't mean you become passive or allow yourself to be walked over. Quite the opposite. You're making a calculated decision to withdraw your emotional investment from someone who has proven they cannot be trusted with it. You're applying the same strategic thinking that Machiavelli advised princes to use when dealing with unreliable allies, appear cooperative while preparing for betrayal. The manipulator will initially escalate their tactics when they realize their usual methods aren't working. They'll push harder, create bigger scenes, manufacture more urgent crises. This is not a sign that your strategy is failing, it's confirmation that it's working. They're revealing the true desperation beneath their confident facade, and desperation makes people careless. Careless people make mistakes, and people who make mistakes in the presence of someone who's been quietly observing and cataloging their behavior patterns find themselves at a severe disadvantage when the moment comes to strike back. The beauty of these first two approaches is that they require no special skills, no confrontation, no dramatic gestures that might backfire. They simply require you to stop participating in your own manipulation. You stop feeding the beast and you stop providing the reactions that make their psychological games profitable. You become a student of their methods rather than a victim of them, and in doing so, you begin to understand something that most people never realize. The manipulator's power exists only as long as you continue to grant it to them. The moment you withdraw your participation, their entire system begins to collapse. But studying their methods and withdrawing your participation is only the beginning of your education in the art of psychological warfare. The third way to dismantle a manipulator's power over you requires you to master something that will feel counterintuitive to your moral sensibilities. You must learn to lie by omission with the precision of a surgeon. Machiavelli understood that information is the ultimate currency of power, and the manipulator's greatest advantage lies in knowing more about you than you know about them. They've spent months, perhaps years, collecting intelligence about your fears, your insecurities, your triggers, your weaknesses. Meanwhile, you've been an open book, sharing your thoughts, your plans, your vulnerabilities, believing that transparency builds trust. This asymmetry of information is what gives them their power, and it's what you must systematically destroy. The manipulator asks you about your weekend plans, and you think you're having a casual conversation. But they're gathering intelligence. They want to know who you're seeing, what you're doing, how you're feeling, because every piece of information becomes a potential weapon in their psychological arsenal. Your excitement about a new relationship becomes something they can undermine with subtle comments about your judgment in partners. Your stress about work becomes something they can exploit by creating additional pressure at exactly the wrong moment. Your financial concerns become leverage they can use to make you dependent on their help or advice, so you stop feeding them information. Not in an obvious way that would alert them to your new strategy, but gradually, systematically, strategically. You become vague about your plans. You deflect their probing questions with questions of your own. You share nothing that could be used against you later, and you start paying attention to the information they're trying to extract and asking yourself why they need to know it. This isn't paranoia, it's strategic thinking. The manipulator has trained you to believe that withholding information is somehow wrong, that privacy is selfish, that boundaries are mean. But Machiavelli knew that a prince who reveals all his secrets to his advisors soon finds himself without a kingdom. The same principle applies to your personal relationships. The manipulator doesn't need to know your emotional state, your financial situation, your relationship problems, your career concerns, or your family drama. They want to know these things because knowledge is power, and they intend to use that power against you. When you stop providing them with fresh intelligence, they're forced to operate with outdated information, and outdated information leads to strategic mistakes. The fourth way requires you to embrace a tactic that most people find deeply uncomfortable. You must learn to become unpredictable in your reactions. Manipulators are creatures of pattern recognition. They study how you respond to different types of pressure, different emotional triggers, different psychological techniques, and then they optimize their approach based on your predictable responses. If they know that guilt makes you compliant, they'll use guilt. If they know that anger makes you defensive, they'll provoke anger. If they know that fear makes you seek their protection, they'll manufacture fear. Your predictability is their greatest asset, which means your unpredictability becomes their greatest nightmare. Start responding to their manipulative tactics in ways they don't expect. When they try to make you feel guilty, respond with curiosity instead of defensiveness. When they attempt to provoke anger, respond with amusement. When they try to create urgency, respond with deliberate slowness. When they expect you to explain yourself, ask them to explain themselves instead. This isn't about being difficult or argumentative. It's about systematically destroying their ability to predict and control your responses. The manipulator has invested considerable time and energy into learning your psychological patterns, and when those patterns suddenly become unreliable, their entire strategy collapses. But here's what makes this approach truly devastating. Unpredictability forces them to reveal more of their own tactics. When their usual methods stop working, they'll try new approaches, and each new approach gives you additional insight into their psychological toolkit. They'll become more aggressive, more desperate, more obvious in their manipulation attempts, because they're no longer operating from a position of confidence. They're scrambling, improvising, revealing the crude mechanics behind what once seemed like sophisticated psychological chess. You're no longer dancing to their rhythm, you're forcing them to dance to yours. And most manipulators are terrible dancers when they're not leading. The combination of information control and behavioral unpredictability creates something that manipulators find deeply unsettling: uncertainty. They've built their entire approach around certainty, around knowing how you'll react, around being able to predict and control your responses. When that certainty disappears, when they can no longer reliably push your buttons or extract the information they need, they begin to experience something they're not equipped to handle, the same psychological discomfort they've been inflicting on others. Now you begin to see the manipulator for what they truly are beneath their confident facade, a psychological bully who crumbles when their victims stop playing by the established rules. The fifth way to destroy their power over you demands that you master an art form Machiavelli perfected in the political arena. You must learn to mirror their energy back to them with surgical precision. When the manipulator creates drama, you don't absorb it, you don't react to it, you reflect it back to them like a perfectly polished mirror reflects light. They want to create chaos in your life, but instead of allowing that chaos to take root in your emotional landscape, you let it bounce off you and return to its source. This requires a level of emotional discipline that most people never develop, but it's the difference between being a victim of psychological warfare and being a master of it. The manipulator raises their voice, hoping to trigger your fight or flight response, hoping to make you either cower or escalate, because both reactions give them control over the emotional temperature of the interaction. Instead, you match their volume exactly, not in anger, but in calm intensity. They speak to you with condescension, expecting you to either apologize or defend yourself, both of which put you in a subordinate position. Instead, you respond with the same tone of condescension, but directed back at their behavior rather than at them personally. They try to rush you into a decision, hoping your discomfort with pressure will make you compliant. Instead, you create the same sense of urgency around their need for an immediate answer, asking them why they're so desperate to rush something that requires careful consideration. You're not copying their behavior, you're reflecting their psychological state back to them, forcing them to experience what they're trying to make you experience. This mirroring technique works because manipulators are fundamentally cowards who prey on people they perceive as psychologically weaker than themselves. They've never learned to handle their own medicine because they've never had to take it. When you refuse to absorb their negative energy and instead redirect it back to its source, you're forcing them to confront something they've spent their entire lives avoiding, the consequences of their own behavior. Most manipulators have never had someone treat them the way they treat others, and the experience is profoundly disorienting for them. They don't know how to respond because they've never been on the receiving end of their own tactics. The sixth way requires you to embrace a concept that will fundamentally alter how you view every interaction with manipulative people. You must understand that everything they say is a negotiation, and most of what they're negotiating for is your emotional submission. When the manipulator makes a statement that sounds like a fact, they're actually making an opening bid in a psychological negotiation. When they express disappointment in your behavior, they're not sharing a feeling, they're making a strategic move designed to extract guilt and compliance from you. When they tell you that you're being unreasonable, they're not offering an objective assessment, they're attempting to define the terms of engagement in a way that favors their position. Once you understand that literally everything coming out of their mouth is a calculated attempt to gain psychological leverage over you, their power begins to evaporate. You stop taking their statements at face value and start asking yourself what they're really trying to accomplish with each comment, each question, each seemingly innocent observation. They tell you that you seem stressed, and instead of explaining your stress or denying it, you recognize this as an attempt to gather intelligence about your emotional state so they can exploit it later. They suggest that you're overreacting to something, and instead of defending your reaction or questioning your own perceptions, you understand this as an attempt to gaslight you into doubting your own judgment. They offer to help you with a problem you never asked for help with, and instead of feeling grateful, you recognize this as an attempt to create artificial dependency that they can leverage in future interactions. This shift in perspective transforms every conversation from a potential trap into a fascinating study in psychological manipulation. You're no longer a participant in their games. You're an anthropologist observing their behavior patterns, cataloging their techniques, understanding their underlying motivations. The manipulator becomes less threatening and more pathetic as you begin to see the desperate insecurity that drives their need to control others. They're not powerful predators, they're emotional parasites who've learned to disguise their weakness as strength, their neediness as dominance, their fear as aggression. And parasites, Machiavelli would remind you, can only survive as long as their host remains unaware of their presence. The seventh way demands that you master something most people consider impossible. You must learn to weaponize their own guilt against them with the cold precision of a master strategist. Manipulators are experts at manufacturing guilt in others, but they've built their entire psychological framework on the assumption that they themselves are immune to this weapon. This assumption is their fatal flaw. Every manipulator carries within them a carefully hidden reservoir of shame and guilt about their own behavior, but they've learned to deflect and project these feelings onto their victims rather than confronting them directly. When you learn to redirect their guilt manufacturing techniques back toward their source, you're essentially turning their most powerful weapon into their greatest vulnerability. The manipulator tries to make you feel guilty for setting a boundary, for saying no, for protecting your own interests. Instead of absorbing this guilt or defending your right to have boundaries, you express genuine concern for how difficult it must be for them to respect other people's decisions. They attempt to shame you for not trusting them completely, and rather than apologizing or explaining your trust issues, you wonder aloud how exhausting it must be to constantly have to prove their trustworthiness to people. They try to make you feel selfish for prioritizing your own needs, and instead of justifying your self-care, you acknowledge how challenging it must be for them to ask for things without considering the impact on others. You're not being sarcastic or obviously manipulative. You're expressing what appears to be genuine empathy for their psychological struggles, but you're forcing them to confront the reality of their own behavior in the process. This technique is devastating because it forces the manipulator to either acknowledge their manipulative behavior or maintain their facade while experiencing the full weight of their own guilt-inducing tactics. Most manipulators will choose to retreat rather than engage with this reflected guilt, because they lack the emotional tools to process the feelings they've spent years projecting onto others. They've built their entire identity around being the victim of other people's unreasonableness, other people's selfishness, other people's lack of understanding. When you force them to confront their own contribution to these dynamics, you're threatening the fundamental narrative that allows them to maintain their self-image as the injured party in every interaction. The eighth way requires you to embrace a truth that will transform how you handle every future encounter with psychological manipulation. You must understand that the manipulator's anger is not your emergency. This sounds simple, but it represents a complete revolution in how most people respond to manipulative behavior. When the manipulator becomes angry, frustrated, disappointed, or upset, they're essentially declaring a psychological emergency and demanding that you drop everything to manage their emotional state. They've trained you to believe that their emotional instability is somehow your responsibility, that their anger is a crisis you must immediately resolve, that their disappointment is a problem you must urgently fix. This is perhaps the most insidious aspect of their control system, because it makes you complicit in your own manipulation. But Machiavelli understood something about power that applies perfectly to this dynamic. The moment you accept responsibility for someone else's emotional state, you've handed them complete control over your behavior. Their anger becomes a remote control device they can use to make you dance. Their disappointment becomes a weapon they can deploy to make you comply. Their emotional instability becomes a form of psychological terrorism that keeps you constantly walking on eggshells. When you refuse to treat their emotions as your emergency, when you respond to their anger with calm indifference, when you allow them to experience the full consequences of their emotional choices without rushing in to rescue them from their own feelings, you're essentially cutting the puppet strings they've been using to control your behavior. This doesn't mean you become cruel or indifferent to genuine human suffering. It means you stop enabling emotional manipulation by refusing to reward it with your attention, your energy, your compliance, or your guilty attempts to fix what they've broken. The manipulator's anger is a choice they're making. Their disappointment is a feeling they're cultivating. Their emotional chaos is a strategy they're employing. When you stop treating these manufactured crises as genuine emergencies requiring your immediate intervention, you force them to take responsibility for managing their own emotional state, something most manipulators have never learned to do because they've always had victims willing to do it for them. The beauty of this approach is that it doesn't require you to become confrontational or aggressive. You simply stop participating in the emergency they've declared. Stop dropping everything to manage their feelings. Stop accepting responsibility for emotional states that belong entirely to them. You become Switzerland, neutral, unmoved, and utterly uninterested in getting dragged into wars that have nothing to do with you. The ninth way to neutralize their psychological warfare requires you to master a technique that will feel like betraying your own nature. You must learn to give them exactly what they claim to want, but in a way that exposes the manipulation behind their requests. Manipulators rarely ask for what they actually want directly, because direct requests can be directly refused. Instead, they disguise their true desires behind seemingly reasonable demands, emotional appeals, or manufactured crises. They don't ask you to prioritize their needs above your own. They express hurt that you don't seem to care about them. They don't demand your complete availability. They wonder why you're always so busy when they need you. They don't request your unquestioning obedience. They suggest that you don't trust their judgment, When you learn to fulfill their stated requests in their most literal form, you force them to either accept what they claim to want or reveal the hidden agenda behind their manipulation. The manipulator says they just want you to be honest with them, so you become brutally honest about their behavior patterns, their manipulation techniques, and the impact their actions have on others. They claim they want open communication, so you openly communicate your observations about how they use guilt, fear, and obligation to control people around them. They express a desire for you to trust them more, so you explain in detail exactly why their past behavior has made trust impossible and what specific changes would be required to rebuild it. You're giving them precisely what they asked for, but because their requests were manipulation disguised as reasonable needs, your literal fulfillment of those requests becomes a form of psychological jujitsu that turns their own force against them. This approach is particularly effective because it forces the manipulator to confront the gap between their stated intentions and their actual behavior. Most manipulators have convinced themselves that they're not really manipulating anyone, that they're just trying to get their legitimate needs met, that they're the real victim in these interactions. When you respond to their manipulation by taking their words at absolute face value and giving them exactly what they claim to want, you strip away the plausible deniability that allows them to maintain their self-deception. They can't complain about getting what they asked for without revealing that they weren't actually asking for what they claim to want. The 10th way demands that you embrace something that will fundamentally alter your relationship with confrontation. You must learn to make their manipulation expensive for them in ways they never anticipated. Manipulators operate on the assumption that their tactics are cost-free, that they can attempt to control, guilt, and manipulate you without facing any meaningful consequences for their behavior. This assumption is what makes their approach sustainable over long periods. They've learned that most people will absorb the psychological damage rather than create conflict, will suffer in silence rather than make waves, will sacrifice their own well-being to maintain the illusion of harmony. Your job is to systematically destroy this assumption by making every manipulation attempt cost them something they actually care about. When the manipulator tries to guilt you into changing your plans to accommodate their manufactured emergency, you don't just refuse. You make their attempt to manipulate you into a topic of conversation with mutual friends, family members, or colleagues. Not in a gossipy or vindictive way, but as a genuine request for perspective on whether their behavior seems reasonable to others. You're not trying to damage their reputation. You're simply refusing to keep their manipulation attempts secret, which removes one of their primary sources of power. When they try to use emotional blackmail to get their way, you document the attempt and refer back to it in future interactions, creating a paper trail that makes their patterns visible over time. When they attempt to isolate you from other people who might support you, you make their isolating behavior the subject of discussion with exactly those people they're trying to turn against you. This approach works because manipulators depend on operating in the shadows, on keeping their victims isolated and confused, on maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. When you drag their behavior into the light, when you make their manipulation attempts visible to others, when you create consequences that extend beyond the immediate interaction, you're fundamentally altering the cost-benefit analysis that makes manipulation attractive to them. They're no longer getting compliance at no cost. They're risking exposure, embarrassment, and social consequences every time they attempt to manipulate you. Most manipulators, when faced with these increased costs, will simply move on to easier targets rather than continue investing energy in someone who refuses to be manipulated quietly. The key is to make these consequences feel natural rather than punitive, to present them as your genuine need for perspective and support rather than as retaliation for their behavior. You're not trying to punish them, you're simply refusing to participate in the secrecy that enables their manipulation to continue unchallenged. The 11th way requires you to master the art of psychological aikido with a precision that would make Machiavelli himself proud. You must learn to use their own momentum against them by becoming genuinely curious about their manipulation tactics, rather than defending against them. When the manipulator launches into one of their carefully crafted guilt trips, instead of feeling guilty or getting defensive, you respond with fascination. You ask them to explain their reasoning, to walk you through their logic, to help you understand why they believe their approach will be effective. You treat their manipulation attempt like a fascinating psychological experiment that you're genuinely interested in studying, and this shift in your response completely destroys their ability to achieve their intended effect. The manipulator tells you that you're being selfish, and instead of defending your actions or feeling bad about your choices, You ask them to define selfishness for you, to explain how they distinguish between healthy self-care and problematic selfishness, to help you understand what specific behaviors they would prefer to see instead. They try to make you feel guilty for setting boundaries, and rather than justifying your boundaries or feeling bad about having them, you express genuine curiosity about why boundaries seem to upset them so much, what their experience has been with other people's boundaries, how they typically handle situations where their desires conflict with other people's limits. You're not being sarcastic or obviously mocking them. You're treating their manipulation attempts as interesting psychological phenomena that deserve careful examination and discussion. This approach is devastatingly effective because it forces the manipulator to either abandon their manipulation attempt or double down in ways that make their tactics increasingly obvious and pathetic. Most manipulation works by operating below the level of conscious awareness, by triggering automatic emotional responses that bypass rational analysis. When you respond to their manipulation with conscious curiosity instead of unconscious reactivity, you drag their tactics into the light where they can be examined, questioned, and ultimately dismissed. The manipulator finds themselves in the impossible position of either explaining why their manipulation should work on you or abandoning the attempt entirely, and either choice represents a complete failure of their strategy. The 12th and final way to outsmart manipulative people requires you to embrace the most counterintuitive principle in Machiavelli's entire philosophy. You must learn to become genuinely grateful for every manipulation attempt, because each one is a gift of information about who you're really dealing with. Every time someone tries to guilt you, gaslight you, pressure you, or control you, they're providing you with invaluable intelligence about their character, their intentions, and their relationship to the truth. They're showing you exactly who they are when they think they can get away with it. And this information is worth more than gold because it allows you to make informed decisions about how much trust, time, energy, and access to give them in the future. Most people experience manipulation attempts as attacks, as sources of stress and confusion, as problems to be solved or endured. But Machiavelli would tell you to view them as reconnaissance missions conducted by people who have voluntarily revealed their willingness to deceive and exploit you. They've just handed you the most valuable gift possible, certain knowledge of their true nature. When someone shows you that they're willing to manipulate you, they've eliminated all ambiguity about who they are and what they're capable of. You no longer have to wonder whether they truly care about your well-being, whether they can be trusted with sensitive information, whether they'll respect your boundaries when it's inconvenient for them. They've answered all these questions definitively through their actions. This perspective transforms every interaction with manipulative people from a source of stress into an opportunity for intelligence gathering. You stop taking their manipulation attempts personally and start viewing them as valuable data points in your ongoing assessment of their character. You become a collector of evidence rather than a victim of psychological warfare, a strategic analyst rather than an emotional target. The manipulator thinks they're playing chess with your emotions, but you're actually playing a completely different game where their every move provides you with additional information that you can use to protect yourself and others from their influence. When you reach this level of psychological sophistication, manipulative people become easy to spot, easy to handle, and ultimately irrelevant to your emotional well-being. You've learned to extract value from their attempts to devalue you, to gain clarity from their efforts to confuse you, to become stronger from their attempts to weaken you. You've mastered the most important lesson Machiavelli ever taught, that knowledge of your enemy's nature is the foundation of all victory, and those who voluntarily reveal their nature through their actions have already handed you the keys to their defeat. The student has become the master, the victim has become the strategist, and the psychological warfare that once threatened to destroy you has become the very foundation of your strength. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you recognizes the truth in Machiavelli's cold wisdom. You understand now that being manipulated isn't a character flaw, it's a strategic disadvantage that can be corrected through knowledge and discipline. The 12 ways I've shared with you aren't just tactics, they're a complete transformation of how you engage with psychological predators who mistake your kindness for weakness, your empathy for stupidity, your authenticity for vulnerability. Real power begins the moment you stop apologizing for protecting yourself, stop feeling guilty for refusing to be controlled, stop explaining your boundaries to people who have no intention of respecting them. The manipulators in your life have been counting on your continued participation in their games, your willingness to absorb their emotional chaos, your desperate need to be understood and accepted even by those who view your acceptance as weakness. So tell me in the comments, Are you ready to be called difficult, unreasonable, even cruel by people whose opinions should mean nothing to you? Are you willing to trade their approval for your freedom? If this wisdom resonates with the strategist awakening inside you, write, "I choose my power."